be a lot of sunshine here. And once again, we could see temperatures in the low to the mid-20s in Celsius, but cooler out towards the west, of course, underneath the cloud and with the eventual rain. And here comes that low pressure system swinging in as we head through Monday. It's going to give us quite widespread rain on Monday, especially through the afternoon. So expect it to turn a lot more showery as we head through next week, and there'll be a drop in temperature too. So unsettled and cooler as we head through next week. Bye-bye for now.
Be ready. Change can happen in an instant. Check on the BBC Weather app.
For now, it's a defensive position and can only be activated if the militia attack.
They are proud of their democracy, but they also fear it's now under threat from China like never before.
Every time the government drops tear gas, people disperse, but the farmers come back.
When you're this close to the river, which is a front line, you are always watched, so you have to move quickly.
There when the story breaks. BBC News. Follow on the app.
The BBC World Service has always been something that has just given me a sense of anchoring wherever you go, that it's always accessible.
BBC World Service has been my compass. We need news that give us facts that doesn't distort our world.
I want news, I want science, I want facts, giving me the information so that I can make up my own mind.
The World Service definitely keeps people informed, and I love it.
The BBC World Service. Listen on Sounds.
How to report on the thorny issue of migration. Welcome to Newswatch with me, Rajini Vaidyanathan, standing in for Samira this week. Coming up, does BBC News provide a wide enough range of views and context about those seeking to move to the UK? And was the line-up on Sunday's Laura Kuenssberg show a fair reflection of the local election results? Over the past few years, the subject of migration has never been far from the top of the agenda, politically, socially and journalistically. But it presents challenges for news organisations because of the complexity of the issues involved, the passionately polarised emotions it produces and the way certain terms and images tend to dominate the debate. Here are three recent examples of BBC reporters covering the subject.
Net migration reached record levels in 2022 and 2023. That's the difference between the number of people arriving and leaving. You might have got the impression that it's small boats that have driven a record rise in net migration.
They haven't. While the issue's important, in the context of overall immigration, the numbers are tiny.
Rwanda. Is this country in East Africa at least part of the solution to the huge pressures of international migration? The government thinks so, but it's been one heck of a journey to try to get asylum seekers sent there.
No ifs, no buts. These flights are going to Rwanda. Enough is enough.
This was the scene last week as smugglers clashed with police on a French beach. And in the middle of the chaos, one unforgettable image of a small girl perched on her father's shoulders. A 7-year-old girl with moments left to live. We now know her name was Sarah.
Andrew Harding reporting there, and before him, colleagues Chris Mason and Ros Atkins. The coverage of migration often appears in the Newswatch inbox. For example, this point made to us by Julia Howe. The net migration story is about much more than the boats, she says. It's about Brexit and other policy decisions. To show an image of Channel migrants plays right into the government's oversimplified messaging of stop the boats. One picture can say 1,000 words, and is lazy journalism. Meanwhile, Stefan Badham was more concerned by some of the terminology being used. The BBC doesn't describe migrants who arrive in the UK illegally by boat as illegal migrants, he says. Instead, it describes them as migrants who arrive in the UK without permission. No, BBC, any migrant who arrives in the UK or any other country without permission is, by definition, of breaking a country's immigration law an illegal migrant, says Stefan. Well, as part of its impartiality plan, the BBC board commissioned a review of the corporation's migration coverage, which was published on Tuesday. Its author, Madeleine Sumption, is director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford and a member of the Migration Advisory Committee. That's an independent panel which advises the government. And she joins me now in the studio. Welcome to Newswatch, Madeleine. It's an extensive report. One of your main findings says this: the BBC produces a lot of excellent content on migration, but there are also weaknesses. We'll come to the weaknesses in a second, but tell us where you think the BBC is doing well on this.
I think one of the areas where we see particularly good content is in some ways where it's easiest, which is some of the long-form content, so some of the documentaries or long-form audio, where the journalists really have time to delve into the issues. I think the big challenge then is the shorter-form content. When someone's only got 2.5 minutes for a typical TV package, how do you make sure that that you have enough depth that the audience is sort of learning something new and interesting? That's where the real challenges emerge, I think.
So that's one of the weaknesses that you identified then, the ability to explain in depth.
That's right. I think explanation is really key. And one of the things that came up in some of the coverage is that there was sometimes quite a superficial coverage of maybe, a high-profile person has said something about migration, or there's been a new development in a long-running story like the government's plan to try and send asylum seekers to Rwanda. And sometimes in the audience research that we commissioned, audience participants, they found that they didn't feel that they were getting enough background. So they were being told the latest thing, but they didn't really understand, well, hang on, what is this policy? Why do we have it in the first place? How does it work? Some of that explanation sometimes got lost in some of these shorter form stories.
Picking up on what we heard from Julia just then, she said the net migration story is much more than the boats. And she said that one picture can say 1,000 words and is lazy journalism. That's something that you explore in this, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I think it's many of the audience members that we did research with were actually quite surprised to learn from some pieces of the content that they saw that people crossing in small boats were actually a tiny percentage of the total, that most migration is people coming on visas like work and study visas. And those other kinds of migration, legal migration, has not had as much coverage in the last couple of years, partly because it, until quite recently, was not as high profile politically, which leads to another problem that I think that a lot of the coverage has been quite driven by what politicians are saying and what the debate is in Westminster, which obviously is important, but there's also more than that. And so there's a risk that the BBC could be perhaps slower to pick up on some of these important stories, like, for example, the number of care workers who started coming to the UK in early 2023. Some of those important stories can get a bit lost if politicians aren't yet discussing them.
You spoke to somebody, an anonymous BBC staff member, who said to you, there are times when it's so obvious the government is literally saying to the political correspondents, this is what we want to talk about this week, and then we do. Now, I'm sure my colleagues at BBC Westminster would dispute that's how they do their reporting. But as we head closer to a general election where this is a massive political issue, what are the concerns around making sure that every angle is covered in an adequate manner?
One of the things that I think there perhaps hasn't been enough of in BBC coverage is some of that bigger picture of, OK, well, what happens not just at the moment that people are arriving in the UK, we get a lot of that, but we don't hear that much about what happens later down the line, how do people settle in, what are the impacts of migration in communities. And that was one of the issues that was really important to audiences across the spectrum, actually, but particularly to audiences who were worried about the impacts of migration. They wanted to hear much more of that bigger picture.
Another thing that often comes up around this debate is the language used when we discuss this subject. And we heard from Stefan there raising his personal concerns about language used on some of our BBC coverage. There is a big question about when you use the phrase illegal immigration, when do you say migrant, when do you say refugee? And that was the focus of an entire chapter of your review.
Sometimes, for example, if you're talking about asylum seekers, audiences did have a general picture of what an asylum seeker was, but wanted a bit more explanation. This is someone who has applied for to be recognised as a refugee in the country. They haven't yet received a decision, and that is why they are, perhaps staying in asylum accommodation or whatever the story might be about. So I think it's really just about making sure that we're not just using the terms, but really giving people an understanding of what type of migration is at stake.
OK, Madeleine Sumption, thank you very much for talking through that review that you conducted here on Newswatch.
Thank you for having me.
Last week's local elections were covered extensively across the BBC on an overnight programme across last Thursday evening and Friday morning. And as the results dribbled through over the weekend too, on TV, radio, podcasts and online. Well, Dawn Smith was a satisfied customer, writing, "Thank you for keeping those of us with a weirdly insatiable appetite for all things related to elections up to date." But Karen Bailey wondered, why for the last couple of days, most of Friday and Saturday morning, did the BBC think it was a good idea to give so much excessive coverage to English local elections here in Scotland? Well, there were no votes taking place in Scotland or in Northern Ireland, but the coverage provided across the UK continued into Sunday morning, when Laura Kuenssberg's guests included two Conservatives, Transport Secretary Mark Harper and former Home Secretary Suella Braverman.
I love my country, I care about my party, and I want us to win. And I'm urging the Prime Minister to change course, to, with humility, reflect on what the voters are telling us and change the plan and the way that he's communicating and leading us.
Well, her appearance and the lineup in general prompted this phone message.
Hi, I'm wondering why on Sunday's Laura Kuenssberg programme, following the local England elections, why there were no guests from the Lib Dems or the Greens or from even George Galloway's Workers' Party, and why Suella Braverman was invited on as a guest. Where's the balance?
Well, James Steele echoed that sentiment, emailing, "The Liberal Democrats came second in the local elections with 522 councillors, plus 104, whereas the Conservative Party came third with 515, minus 474. Yet two Conservative MPs were invited onto the show, and no Liberal Democrats. Surely the show should be giving a voice to those who have a large mandate, not over-promoting those who lost their mandate." Andrew Pickering added, "The prominence given to Suella Braverman's rant was a sad reflection of editorial policy." Well, the Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg team pointed out to us that Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey had been on the show the previous weekend. The party's Foreign Affairs spokesperson Layla Moran appeared the week before, and Green Party co-leader Carla Denyer was on the week before that. They added, "Throughout the series, we aim to have a wide range of experts and politicians on the programme. Suella Braverman's the former Home Secretary in the current government. As such, her views on the recent election results for the Conservative Party are of interest. As we look forward to the general election, we'll be inviting representatives from all main parties onto the show for discussion and debate." Thanks for all of your comments this week. If you want to share your opinions about what you see or hear on BBC News, on TV, radio, online and social media, you can email newswatch@bbc.co.uk, or you can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, @NewsWatchBBC. You can also call us on 0370 010 6676 and do have a look at previous interviews on our website, bbc.co.uk/Newswatch. That's all from us now. Thanks very much for joining us. Do think about getting in touch and perhaps even coming on the programme. Samira's back to hear more of your thoughts about how the BBC covers the news next week. From me and the team, goodbye.
I want Hip Life to be that good story that lifted black folks in Africa and all over the world, gave young people a voice.
It's part of being an actor, because I always say as an actor, you can't be a control freak. You have to be willing to give up control.
So I like this idea of a live piece of art. And I just like this idea of making invisible visible through art.
Sometimes you can have really serious portraits, but
You've got such a great laugh. I feel like I want to capture some of the candid nature of your personality.
Opera House can and must be many things. It shouldn't cater just to one audience, and it shouldn't be focused on just one corner of the repertoire. It must do everything and be open to the interests of many different people.
Inspiring arts and culture. Watch now on iPlayer.
It's the first US presidential rematch in almost 70 years, with the polls suggesting it will be a tight race decided by narrow margins. Get the latest headlines in the BBC News app. Get in-depth coverage from this historic election campaign on bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story on the US election with BBC News.
Morning. Come and have a seat. Now, of course, I'm not going to go easy on you. There are some really big questions we've got to try and get answers to this morning. But I'll be fair, and we just want to hear what you've got to say. So, shall we get on with it?
We're rolling.
Here we go. Join me to hear from the biggest names inside and outside politics.
Sunday with Laura Koonsberg. Sundays at 9 on BBC One and iPlayer.
This is BBC News. We'll have the headlines for you at the top of the hour, which is straight after this programme.
According to Britain's biggest cancer charity, someone is diagnosed with cancer here in the UK every 2 minutes.
Despite massive progress, many treatments are still incredibly harsh and not always successful.
However, we now have technologies like AI and robotics, which are helping us to discover more effective drugs with fewer side effects quicker.
One in 2 of us will be diagnosed with cancer in our lifetime. 1 in 2. For years, treatment has been centred around surgery, chemotherapy and radiotherapy, sometimes a combination.
Cancer therapy has evolved over the last 2 decades, in particularly shifting away from chemotherapy for every patient and for every cancer to personalised treatment. In some cancers, we have really made great progress. 10, 15 years ago in melanoma,